welcome from my side. I'm very happy to see you here in our online seminar, 1,000 Places in One World. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Professor Priyanka with her guests whom she's presenting in her round table. Dr. Priyanka Jha, I can't pronounce it really good, is assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, Banaras Hindu University, India. Dr. Jha is currently the visiting professor here at the Center for the History of Women Philosophers and Scientists, and was a visiting lecturer at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Hildesheim, where she taught women thinkers from India and was an invited expert for the DFG COSALIC project, Histories of Philosophy in a Global Perspective. Dr. Jha was also the 20th Dr. D.C. Pavitt Visiting Fellow at the University of Cambridge in the Department of Politics and International Studies, and a Sussex Fellow at the University of Cambridge from January to May 2022. She is currently also serving as section editor of the series Women's Cultural Heritage Collection, in which she presents source texts from the intellectual heritage of women philosophers in original language and English translation. She currently also guest edits the Brill journal, Women in the History of Philosophy and Scholarship, and in the history of philosophy and scientists. So very sorry for this complications here. I'm happy now to hand over to Priyanka Jha, and I'm looking forward to an exciting session on women's cultural heritage from India. Thank you so much.
A very warm good afternoon to all of you from the University of Paderborn here at the Center of History of Women Philosophers and Scientists, and good evening to all the participants who've joined from India. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all for the last last lecture as part of 1,000 Voices in One World that the center has been organizing since January. And it gives me a huge privilege and a lot of joy to welcome you to this roundtable that we have as part of the Intercontinental New Voices series. And the attempt today is to engage with the long history of women thinking and philosophy from India, whereby we are mapping 3 women thinkers, 3 voices from 18th to 19th century. And I'm very, very happy as this roundtable would be led by 3 eminent scholars who've joined us: Dr. Namrata Chaturvedi from Zakir Hussain College, University of Delhi, Dr. Arti Minocha from Lady Shri Ram College, and Dr. Sanchayita Paul from Bengal. So quickly, before we get into the formalities of introduction, I just want to make 2 big arguments that through this panel today, what we want to aim at, firstly, is to introduce the Indian section, Indian and South Asian section of the Women in Heritage collection of De Gruyter, whereby led by the series editor-in-chief, Professor Ruth Hagengruber, whereby the attempt is to find these lost women voices and these texts that were written in different languages, and the necessity of translating them and bringing them in a way to look at how were these women writing, responding to the times, and if that becomes an interesting entry into locating the contemporary concerns. Are there any continuities? Are there any discontinuities? And when we bring these gendered embodiments, when we bring these gendered voices, do we get a different imagination, not just of the South, not just of the times, but also the world at large? So what happens when we bring these texts from earlier times to sort of understand and gauge the contemporary? And as I've been arguing, and many of us who work on modern India and on also 19th century India, that Indian Women Thinking Project was a very deep, diverse, and historical trajectory of ideation. So by bringing these three voices from three different times, the aim is to also bring to you the diversity of not just writings, and this diversity was not just being reflected in terms of the vernaculars or language, but also more significantly, how do they, is there a thematic that emerges? Because when we are going to the 18th century and then we come to the 19th century, is there a thread, is there a thematic which is emerging, or is it something which is new? So these, the three women thinkers that we are going to talk about today, we would start with the esoteric saint philosopher Sant Dayabai, and then we would, who's from Rajasthan, who's from the Western India. Then we move up towards the Northern India, whereby we bring the writings of Hardevi and her London Yatra, who's writing from Lahore. And then we move towards the Eastern, closer to my location. We move towards Eastern, we come to Kailashbasini Devi from Bengal. So these are three women voices and three texts that we would be doing as part of this roundtable. This roundtable is a conversation. And the format would be, we would have 10 to 12 minutes lecture by our experts. And then we would have some question and answers. But before we get into the roundtable, let me just quickly introduce our speakers. The first presentation is from Dr. Namrata Chaturvedi, who's going to speak today on the philosophy of devotion in the writings of Sant Dayabai. Dr. Namrata Chaturvedi teaches in the Department of English, Zakir Hussain College, University of Delhi. Besides her many research papers and articles, her published works includes Memory, Metaphor, and Mysticism in Kalidasa's Abhigyan Shakuntalam, which was published by Anthem Press in 2020, and Fatsung Kahani Mitti Ki. It's a translation of a novel from Nepali into Hindi, published in 2023 by Vani Prakashan. Her forthcoming books are titled as Awakening of Grace and Garland of Prayer, translation which would be part of the De Gruyter series. And yes, I'm very excited about this, Daughters of Light, Journeys with India's Women Mystics. So this is our first speaker, Dr. Namrata Chaturvedi. Now I would come to our second esteemed speaker, Dr. Arti, who would be speaking on Imagining Communities, the travel writings of Hardevi of Lahore. Dr. Minocha teaches in the Department of English as an associate professor at my alma mater, Lady Shri Ram College, University of Delhi. She has taught various courses in Hindi literature, modern British literature, world literature, and women's writing. She has also published extensively in the areas of Indian theatre, print culture studies, and gendered histories of colonial Punjab. In fact, I was trying to look up something on Hardevi and I found Dr. Minocha's essays and articles. So I was like, really, I'm really excited to hear more about, you know, the travelogue writing. It's so unfortunate that when we talk about the travelogue writing, somewhere it starts with Rahul Sankratayan, who's invoked as the first travelogue writer. But I am sure that Dr. Minocha would be breaking that myth and would be bringing us to the world of women writing, and especially travelogue writing. When a woman travels and sees the world, what are the imaginations that emerges? So that would be the second presentation for today. And the third and the last, we come to the late 19th and early 20th century with the writing of Kailashbasini Devi that Dr. Sanchayita Paul would be presenting. Today has been rather a very hectic day for Sanchayita, so I'm very, very grateful that, you know, it's 8:30 in the evening and she should be celebrating, but she's with us. So super grateful, Sanchayita, for making the time. The title of her presentation is Thinking in a Woman's Way, Kailashbasini Devi and Women Intellectual in Colonial Bengal, 1847 to 1883. Dr. Sanchayita Paul Chakravarti is an assistant professor in English and is also the director of Kailashbasini Center for Women's Studies in Dr. Meghnad Saha College, Bengal. Her doctoral research is based on the critique of Hindu Brahminic patriarchy in Bengali women's writings in the colonial period. Her research interest includes women's studies, decolonial studies, gendered intellectual history, and translation studies, and she's also a prolific contributor and writer. She has contributed numerous articles and book chapters in a lot of very prestigious journals like Journal of Literary and Cultural Inquiry, Kairos, the Journal of Critical Symposium, Intersections, Gender and Sexuality in Asia and Pacific, Global Media Journal. She was also working as the translator in various literary projects, and she's published extensively from Bengali to English, and also a lot of translation from Bengali to English. So the world of translations. And just before I give the floor to Dr. Namrata, I want to tell you that this De Gruyter Women in Heritage Collection series and the Indian section, Indian South Asian section, is a three-part text whereby we have the original writing, and then there is a translation in English with a long introduction on each of the authors. So this whole series is geared in a way to not just bring attention to what they are writing or their work, but also to have a longish introduction in placing these women writers, intellectuals, and thinkers in the larger projects of global histories of philosophy, global intellectual histories. And I can see that some of my dear friends from Hildesheim who are doing some great work there for global history have also joined. So without taking any more time, I now request Dr. Namrata Chaturvedi, who would be the first speaker for this roundtable panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyanka. Thank you, Ruth. Good evening, everyone. Good evening from India. I think it's afternoon there.
Yes, it's 4:20.
It's 4:20. Okay, I will first see if this works. It's visible?
Yes, it is. It is.
Okay, I'll make this into a slideshow. All right, there's an echo. Is somebody's audio? I can hear my own voice.
Could we please request everyone to kindly mute themselves for the course of the roundtable? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, all right. I think, yeah, it's all right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Priyanka, the whole team. And thank you to everybody for joining us for a session on women's intellectual and philosophical knowledge making and histories. I'm very, very happy that this is not one out of the many sessions in any other conference where one session or two sessions are kept away only for women's writing. But this is a session where we're only going to talk about women's minds and their thoughts and their words. The wonderful introduction that Priyanka had given, it made me think of 2 points that she mentioned. The first point was about continuities and discontinuities. And the second point towards the end, when she talked about breaking the myths, when we were talking about travelogues and Rahul Sankrityayan, I think this is a point for us to begin our roundtable today. My presentation will be talking about continuities and the unfortunate discontinuities in literary historiography of women's writing, and secondly of breaking the myth. So I will begin first by talking about these 2 things. All right, the first is about continuities and discontinuities. I have used here an image of 2 years ago when I was researching for my forthcoming book, Daughters of Light. I'm in the Himalayas near Darjeeling, and here I'm face to face with an early 20th century Nepali Sant. When I say Sant, I mean saint, a saint poetess whose writings are almost completely scattered and unavailable. All I could find were 3 bhajans, 3 devotional poems composed by her, this statue of her, which was recently made by a students' union, and a samadhi, a sanctified grave, which also was discovered only in the late 1990s. So here in this picture, I was trying to touch the statue to perhaps have a conversation with her. So I'm starting on a methodological point of discontinuity. In my experience of the last 5-6 years of researching on this subject, these are the blocks that I've faced, which I believe many of us who are working on women's literature, women's writing, women's thought would have faced. So the histories and writings of women are not, in my experience, they're not documented properly. So when it comes to centuries of separation from their times and ours, in my context, all I found were hagiographies, scattered hagiographies, some oral records, but no proper documentation. So it becomes very, very difficult to separate fact from fiction, to separate actual lives lived from exaggerations, from distortions. That was the first, that has been a continuous struggle against continuity. Then the writings themselves, the works, they're either lost or damaged. Sometimes, if they are preserved, they're poorly preserved. I'm currently working on another project of women's writing, of women's Sant poetry, and this is a constant struggle. They're poorly preserved, they are half damaged, mostly damaged, you can't reproduce them, you can't reprint them. Very often, there are no contexts available for those writings. So, as we have been noticing, many a time, the woman's name, the writer's name is replaced by another name. Very often, the name is not there. So it's very difficult to match name with works. If you do find some works, translation is a major problem. Maybe later in the question answer session, if somebody wishes to talk about this, I would be very happy to talk about the translation of spiritual writing, because that is my core area. Not secular writing, not modern writing, but translation of mystical and spiritual works, which present problems of their own kinds. So they're not translated. Priyanka and Ruth and this project has given me and many of us a chance to translate these works for the very first time. The theorizations are either vague, very generalized, or even worse, they are made in borrowed epistemic frameworks. I will be very happy to talk about this in more detail should a question come up. Now, the second question was about breaking the myth. So when we talk about any Google search on women's spiritual poetry from India, what is normally called as bhakti poetry, women's mystic poetry from India will give us some very predictable names, especially the name of Sant Mirabai. And what has happened is that there's a whole cult of literary theorization. I call it the Mirabai effect. So there's a whole cult that has developed around the idea that a woman saint, a Hindu saint, so a woman Sant, is always singing songs of her god, and she's mesmerized by her god, and she thinks of God as her husband, and this whole bridal mysticism, this Madhurya Bhakti. That's a myth that is not, it is a myth, and Sant Dayabai's writing will break it, because Sant Dayabai was doing nothing of this kind. So here we come to Sant Dayabai. With great difficulty, I have been able to find dates which are closest to the available records on her, and this is also from the oral teaching of a contemporary narrative theologian from North India. In his lectures, it is in his pravachan, in his spiritual discourses, that I was able to come across these dates. So these are roughly her dates, 1730 to 1798. Sant Dayabai is recognized as an ardent disciple of Mahatma Charan Das, the founder of the Charandasi Sampradaya in Charandasi tradition in 18th century North India. The major areas of their influence of this tradition, their practitioners, and their thinkers and teachers. One of the most prominent thinkers and teachers of this tradition was Sant Dayabai. This tradition is very special because Mahatma Charan Das was a man, he was a male guru, but most of the people, most of the prominent disciples whom he had and whom he trained for further dissemination of their teachings were women. So it was a woman-centric tradition. So
Namrata, I'm sorry, but your slides are not moving. Could I request you to?
Can you? What do you see now, Priyanka? Is it the first slide?
Just the front, the first slide.
Oh.
Yeah, now we are on Sant Dayabai's.
Is it okay if I run it this way and not make a slideshow? Maybe that's creating a problem. Is this okay?
Yeah, this is fine. If you could, yeah.
So this tradition, as I was saying, was particularly influential in creating many women thinkers, teachers, and preachers. Sant Dayabai, Sant Sahajobai, Sant Nupibai, many prominent women thinkers belonged to this tradition. The influence area of this was Rajasthan, Delhi, and Vrindavan, the area in and around Delhi, roughly. The two major works that she has composed are known as Dayabodh and Vinay Malika. In our forthcoming book, we are translating both these works in their entirety. These consist of devotional poems in couplets and quartets, what are known as Doha and Chaupai. Her works concentrate upon highlighting single-pointed devotion to her guru and yogic cosmology. There are the themes that are concerned with birth, sinful living, sinful death, deliverance, and stories from the divine and semi-divine ancestral records, which are known as Itahar and Puran in the context of India. The language that she has deployed is a combination of many localized forms of what is now known as Hindi. So there are many localized, I will not call them variations, but they are independent languages of their own. The language of the saints, there's a generic term for the language that the saints were using. It is sometimes called Sant Bhasha, sometimes it's called Sadhukari Bhasha, which would mean language of the saints. It is not a single language, but the saints, as they were composing their poetry, especially in the medieval period, had a language pool of their own, so which has been recognized as a separate language. Some of the features of this are, for instance, common metaphors, invocation of the lineage of the Guru, in her work praising the magnificence of the Guru. These are commonalities you find in many other works also. Descriptions of the illusory nature of the world, and in Dayabai specifically, setting of spiritual goals, very specific setting of spiritual goals and very specific practices which would lead to that. So this is another important myth which I think needs to be broken, that spirituality is not this shapeless, spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions. It is a very specific epistemological journey that women, men, and anyone makes and can make. Now, some of the things that we find in her writing, which I think stand out, are the domestic images, her knowledge of scriptures and history, and the fact that in her writing we see how sentiments they take on feminine meanings. Very specifically, some of these words that I've written here are repeated in her writing, and in the manner in which they are used, there's a very feminine feeling to these emotions. Emotions such as service, adoration, nurturing, care, longing, which we find in the original in words like Niharu, Richaun, Seva, Lagan, Bisaru, Thakat. We can perhaps talk more about this later. So this is, I think, known to everyone, how mysticism and knowledge making are related. Some of these important works we are already aware of. Evelyn Underhill's work, William James, Bernard McKin, Abraham Maslow, who have been talking about the importance of mystical experiences and how we can see them as culturally coded, as self-actualizing phenomena, etc., with specific study of the different stages. Now, in this context, there are a few observations that I have. The first observation is that women's mystical writings are often studied under comparative mysticism, not under comparative philosophy or comparative theology. So I've come across very beautiful, very brilliant studies comparing a mystic from the Spanish tradition, for instance, or a mystic from the Dutch tradition with, say, Sant Mirabai. A mystic here, a mystic there, a woman mystic here, a woman mystic there, but mystics. Now, because of the Christian understandings of mysticism, there tends to be a certain kind of knowledge making here. But in the South Asian context, it may be a different scenario. This is why I'm arguing that it is very important that mystics like Sant Dayabai, Sant Mirabai, or any other saint for that matter, that these mystics, they find their valid place in global philosophy, and if not possible in global philosophy, at least in comparative philosophy or comparative theology. Maybe that could be a point of beginning, though I have my reservations with the manner in which comparative philosophies are often carried out. So that is another point where I say that there should be a knowledge-making approach where something like darshan, the word darshan, which is the Indian word for philosophy, which perhaps we can translate as experiential knowledge. So experiential knowledge and or grounded theology, a theology from ground up, which is what someone like Sant Dayabai or many other mystics, this is what Sant Kabir, Sant Mirabai, this is what they're doing. So darshan and grounded theology, if we can focus on these, we would be doing much service to knowledge making in the contemporary world without necessarily using the epistemological crux of comparative studies, so that we can bring the texts back to their rightful contexts. We can certainly talk about this later. So here are a few points on spiritual literature and philosophy. So these are my arguments, that literary engagement with women's spiritual writing is the first step towards validating their experiences that have been relegated to a lower status, or sometimes, as we all well aware, of negative status. Now, what do these writings offer us? Something like Sant Dayabai's work, or Sant Mirabai's, what does this work give us? Now, they help us in identifying and opening up complex layers of meanings which are embedded in transpersonal experiences. What are the stages? What are the methods? What are her madnesses? What are the stages of her spiritual journey? And the narrative reconfigurations that she's creating for us. So I was, the other day I was listening to an interview of a saint who passed away recently. And when she was asked about her experiences, she said, it's like putting a sweet in the mouth of a dumb person. So the interviewer was asking her, what has been your experience of God? She was a hermit living alone in the Himalayas for years. So he managed to meet her. And when he asked her, she said, words fail me. I cannot express this. So when a mystic is choosing to write about her experiences, these are the complex layers uncovering which is very, very exciting. Now, when it comes to something like bhakti literature, in many universities in the world, in South Asian departments, also in departments of comparative religious studies, bhakti literature is often also in history and sociology departments. Bhakti literature is quite a fascinating and interesting area, so much so that it has been overdone with sociological, ethnographic, and historical approaches. Now, what has kind of been left out are the philosophical understandings of bhakti. So my understanding is that the philosophical writing of women in India can be seen in three broad stages. The first is the classical period, wherein we have very important women in the Vedas, in the commentary on the Vedas, in poetry, as poets themselves, poetesses themselves, and as literary critics. So we have a very pronounced and very significant contribution of women in this is also a very understudied area. The closest we come to women in the classical period or women in Hinduism is looking at goddesses. So Kali and Durga and all of this. But the women who were giving us literary theories, literary critical texts, this is one area which is coming up. Then we have the medieval period that we are looking at. So we have in the medieval period, we have a predominant oral tradition. We also, some of us may know, some of us may have some idea about the fact that North India in particular had a very turbulent time in its medieval period. The medieval history of North India is very turbulent, very multicultural, not always in a smooth way. It has been a very, very turbulent period. So the effect of it is that the classical exegesis, the classical writings, the classical commentarial tradition was broken. And what we do have are oral records. And this is why researching on this becomes very, very difficult, because we have a predominant oral culture of bhakti. So we have lived practitioners and vernacular composers. We have women as bhaktas, they are traveling. Sant Dayabai, for example, she's a very good example of this. She was a preacher. She was encouraged by her guru. She had already reached that stage where he sent her to different places. And she made disciples of her own. So we have women as bhaktas, travelers, traveling teachers, preachers, sannyasinis, yoginis. So this period is very exciting and very challenging also, because written records are not available. So there is this discontinuity which we are all in a small ways trying to restore. And then we have the modern period, where there's Western education, a new world opens up, there is formalized writing, and the themes and the concerns of women thinkers, they move more towards non-religious ideas, which are more pertinent to the times and the experiences. We have less of metaphysics, more of the social and the political concerns. So that is also a very, very rewarding and exciting period. Now, I will not take much time because I have very limited time. Very quickly, some of the things that stand out in her darshan, in her philosophy, are these 2 points. And I, in the detailed introduction to the book, I will be talking about this, also bringing in comparative philosophy wherever needed. So I will be talking about Daya and Vinay, which are the original words. The closest translation that I could come up with are the 2 words, grace and prayer. Now, prayer can still be a generic word, but grace is a very specific word coming from a very specific context. So in the critical introduction, I will necessarily be bringing in comparative theology, without which I cannot do justice to this word and to the beautiful meanings of embedded in this word. So in the text, she uses the word Daya, grace, in 2 ways. As her poetic signature, because her own name is Dayabai, after all, Sister Grace in English. So she uses it as a poetic signature, and she also uses it as a qualitative description of her own spiritual practice, which is complete surrender to the grace of the Guru. The other work is called Vinay Malika, which is very, very interesting. Maybe the readers of North Indian literature or people who understand, who have some engagement with Hinduism will immediately recall Tulsidasa's Vinay Patrika. So she is building on Tulsidasa's Vinay Patrika, and she's writing her own Vinay Malika. So if for any reader, for anyone who comes across this, Tulsidasa's Vinay Patrika is already embedded in their consciousness. So she's also using an intertextuality. She's also very smart in doing this, wherein she presents the idea of prayer as the epistemic path to the ontological goal of grace. So we will talk about this in detail in the book. So very quickly, grace and prayer, these 2 major ideas. As in a brief manner, these are some of the ideas that come to mind. The prayer is the cause, grace is the effect. Prayer is essentially an idea which has been put into practice. This is specific to the way she's using this, and this is specific to bhakti. And grace is the experience of the maturation and full realization of that idea. So if we look at it as stages in consciousness, prayer is the expansion of the self. It's the transcendence of individuality. And grace, to me, is the culmination of this expansion, the end point of this expansion, where the individuated and illusory self becomes aware of its essential wholeness, oneness with the one, Brahm in this case. So when I'm talking about grace, naturally I will be talking about Peter Abelard's grace, and this is my little way of bringing in comparative theology, not comparative mysticism, but situating the idea of grace in the intellectual and the philosophical history of the world. So I'm very fascinated with Peter Abelard's philosophy of grace, and I will be making a comparative study so that I can situate her understanding of grace in a more global perspective. Grace, for instance, as being natural and flowing on its own. So the 2 words that we come across in her writing are kripa, kiripa, she says, kripa, which is also grace, and daya, which is also grace. So these being subjective to the giver and thereby spontaneous, very close to the idea of Abelard. And prayer, when I talk about prayer, I'm also reminded of, I'll be bringing in many thinkers. For instance, Swami Vivekananda, who talks about as essential contract between the human and the divine as a necessary principle of our humanness. He says, for instance, he says meditation is not a favor we are doing unto ourselves or unto anyone else. We are just honoring that contract. By meditating on God, we are honoring the contract of being human. He calls it an epistemic necessity of one's humanness, or the idea of the brilliant theologian Raimundo Panikkar, who says the experience of God is an irreversible condition. So the necessary transformation that prayer can bring about is something we will also be talking about in detail. Now, this is the last point. The philosophy, as I said, what we find is one-pointed devotion to one's guru. Now, herein, it's very important to understand this as a specific process and not just as some spontaneous feeling that women are often supposed to have. Mira is dancing for her Krishna. She's just this mad woman who's dancing around. It's not like that. It's a very well thought out epistemic journey. So Dayabai is obsessed with her guru. She talks only and only and only about her guru. Doesn't even talk about God. Just keeps talking about her guru. So what is this? So is this an obsession, or is this a very, very carefully practiced madness? This is what we will be looking at. Some of the points that that I wanted to share are the following: that guru is not a person. Guru is the point of emotional and spiritual centeredness. He's both the means and the end. And what we find in her writing is Guru Bhakti and not Ishta Bhakti. So Guru Bhakti is different from Ishta Bhakti. This is, if you see the last 2 points, Guru Bhakti is different from Ishta Bhakti. For example, in Sant Mirabai's very well-known poetry, we have Ishta Bhakti. She has devoted herself to her deity. But Sant Dayabai has not devoted herself to her deity. She has devoted herself to her master. There's a difference between the two. Now, one way of looking at it is the following, that in Guru Bhakti, the Guru begins as a specific individual with specific teachings and goes on to expand into the principle of awareness itself. In deity worship, the deity begins as an abstract principle that goes on to acquire a definitive epistemic quality and eventually also becomes the principle of awareness. So what do we do in Guru Bhakti is remembrance, chanting, constant practice, which eventually leads to an awareness of the self. And this awareness is experienced by the practitioner as transpersonal communication, reminders, guidance, and overall a sense, this is my final point, and overall a sense of well-being, which is very important for men, women, and everyone. But when it comes to women's philosophy, women's devotional writing, it is very important to realize that this self-actualization is also trauma healing. So this transpersonal leap, it brings about trauma healing, which is very, very vital for self-actualization of women and of men also, but also especially of women, whose traumas may differ from the traumas of men. The nature of the traumas are different. They are shaped by our gendered experiences. The effects of the trauma may be slightly different, may be the same, but the nature of the traumas are different, and therefore the process of healing is also different, specific, and very, very special for women as it is for men. Here are 2 examples. This is one sample translation, one example, wherein we can see the ideas that I had just mentioned before this. So, Daya kahiyo Gurudev ne kuram ko brat lehi, sab indrin puro ki kari, surat swas mein dehi. So, Daya, says my Guru, you must take a vow to be as a tortoise mother, sitting on her eggs, ever present in the now, focusing on none other. Shut your senses, breathe, and take a bow. This is the only way to go further. What is very beautiful here is that she evokes the image of a tortoise mother, a woman writing. She's writing about a specific practice, a pranayam practice where you keep the breath in, breath control. She's a specific yogic practice, but the image that she has chosen is of a tortoise mother. So the very nature of motherhood is very supreme, very superior, and by its very nature, transcendental. This is what she's saying here. The last example is Jaiso Moti Yosako Taiso Ya Sansar Binisi Jayachin Ek Me Daya Prabhu Uradhar. A drop of dew appears like a pearl, sure to dissolve at one touch. So is the world waiting for the final twirl, the grace of God. Daya begs much. Here, also I will be talking about this in the book. These images are coming from the same pool which is giving us these different metaphors in saint literature. But she's playing around, like she's played around with this image, with the image of the dewdrop. Her usage is very different from the way it has been used by her contemporaries and also her predecessors. Very famously, Kabir has made use of this, but her usage is different. And here is one example from one of my visits with a dear friend to this ashram in Haryana, which is of the same saint tradition on which I'm researching. So these are the Charan Dasi followers, and everyone, you can see all the women are wearing yellow. This is why I've used the color yellow and saffron, because the yellow color was the color of the costumes that her guru wore, and all the disciples and followers of this tradition honor to this day. So I'll conclude on this. Thank you on this note.
Thank you so much, Namrata, for this very fascinating presentation and, expanding the esoteric philosophy, the saint philosophy of India, because unfortunately, for generations now, we are just stuck with one saint philosopher, that is Mirabai. But also, in terms of expanding the canon, I would say the gendered canon and the feminist canon, and also delineating the idea of devotion, grace, from a gendered embodiment is very fascinating. But I will keep my comments towards the end. I would now request Dr. Arti Minocha with her talk on presentation on Hardevi, the first female travelogue writer from India.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Evening, because this is India. And thank you so much, Ruth and Priyanka. And thank you, Priyanka, for that generous introduction. Thanks, everybody, for joining in this evening. So the title of my presentation is Imagining Communities, the Travel Writings of Hardevi of Lahore. There's a reason why I don't use the word travelogue. We can take that later. And I'm not sure whether Hardevi is the first travelogue writer. There have been travelogues before her as well that I have found. What I'll do is I'll just talk about some entry points into how I will be reading Hardevi's travelogues. And because of the paucity of time, I'll sort of straight dive into these points that I have to make. So I propose to translate and introduce two travel accounts titled London Yatra and London Jubilee by a woman called Hardevi. And both these were published in 1888. Now, this woman travels from Lahore in Punjab in India to London for a specific purpose, that is to witness Queen Victoria's Jubilee in 1887, which is why the second of the books is called London Jubilee. So these two books written in Hindi, and I think that is very significant, I'll just tell you why. These two books, which were written in Hindi in the Devanagari script, were sent back by her from London to be published in Lahore, because she wanted to address a specific gendered community. So in the preface to London Yatra, she addresses that preface to what she calls the Bhagini Samaj. And if I translate that, to the Society of Sisters. So in this very specific gendered community, the Bhagini Samaj, the address to this particular entity, in addressing this entity, the narratives envision a new inclusive community of women that is ostensibly not organized along caste, class, and or communal lines. Even though late 19th century Punjab was riven precisely by these fissures. So she writes in the context of a Punjab which is divided along caste, class, communal lines, and that kind of narrative feeds directly into the partition of Punjab in the 20th century in 1947. So this was just about the period when Punjab was sort of getting riven by these kinds of fissures. So Hardevi can be placed in the context of late 19th century Punjab, that was marked by religious reform movements, the hardening of communal identities, language politics, which is why I said Hindi is important here, language politics, but also increased mobility and travel, new modes of communication, and proliferation of print networks that were used extensively by the reformist movements. So the three primary reformist movements in Punjab were the Arya Samaj, the Singh Sabha, and the Ahmadiyya movements, the Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim reformist movements. Now, as I was saying that, it is these reformist movements actually make use of the print networks, the cheap print that is available in the 19th century to sort of serve their agenda. So these print networks in the 19th century also opened up new discursive possibilities for women to inhabit public spaces, participate in public discourse through print, undertake travel, mobilize their political agency, and establish associational and print networks. And Hardevi does all of that through her writing. Now, this broader context that I have mapped out is important to understand how this travel writing by Hardevi produces an England for the Punjabi women readership at this particular point in their modernist trajectory. What are the implications of writing back to an imagined readership? And I call that imagined because she says she's writing to a community of women. And so she imagines that community of women. So what are the implications of writing back to an imagined readership? How is travel tied to the reconfiguration of the self and this community of women that she imagines? How is the self positioned variously in relationship to the imperial center which she visits? So these are some of the questions that one can look at. So in these books that are addressed specifically to Punjabi women, and when I say Punjabi, I mean the region, not anything else, but the region of Punjab. So in these books that are addressed specifically to Punjabi women, Hardevi offers to write back the account of her journey on the ship and a visual description of the Jubilee celebrations as a citizen subject, as a social commentator, and above all, as a woman who is morally and ethically committed to her community of women back home. Thus, the travel narrative, in imagining and addressing a specific gendered community, also attempts to create one back home. This community is envisaged as the gendered solidarity of Punjabi sisters, what she calls Punjab Deshiya Bhagini Samaj, so the society of sisters in Punjab. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, this is ostensibly not organized along caste, class, or communal lines. So she tries to be as inclusive as is possible, but of course, there are fissures which are very, very evident in her writing. So the author asks the women of Punjab to read her books for their satisfaction and development, and also read it out to other sisters who cannot read it themselves. Reading a book thus becomes a material marker of modernity and an activity that would shape a new literary sphere for women in the 19th century. So Hardevi asks her sisters to conceive of a modern self through the trajectories of education, mobility, refined domesticity, and family that she finds examples of in London. About her biographical affiliation, so there are very few details available for Hardevi. I cannot even give you a lifespan because I found none. But there are references that can be gleaned from the quarterly lists of books that were published in Punjab, the catalogues of books that were published in Punjab. There are mention of her activities in the Journal of the National Indian Association that was begun by Mary Carpenter in 1871, and this was published in London. And also through her editorials in Bharat Bhagini, a Hindi monthly, a periodical, that she started for women in 1889, and that was published in Lahore and edited by her. The journal, this periodical, mentions that she was the daughter of Rai Bahadur Kanhaiya Lal of Lahore and the wife of Roshan Lal, the barrister of law, etc. Now, what is important to note here is that Hardevi's life and trajectory were related to the development of associational publics and print proliferation in Punjab at the end of the 19th century. So both the father and the husband were reformers, Hindu reformers, middle class reformers. And therefore, I said that her writing is linked to the newly emergent print and public spheres that were made possible by reformist writing. So print and public spheres were the new sites for negotiation and contestation of modern womanhood, and therefore, she finds access to print through these reformers. So Hardevi's access to the press would have been made possible through the middle class reformist groups and therefore ostensibly aligned with their identity politics. Thus, the promotion of Hindi language and the constructions of the Arya woman in the periodical Bharat Bhagini that she edits are quite in consonance with the politics of the Arya Samaj at the end of the 19th century. That came to be centered around a Hindu identity promoted through the Hindi language. So this division and association between language and religion was taking place at the end of the 19th century. So Hindi for Hindus, Punjabi written in the Gurmukhi script for Sikhs, etc., and Urdu for Muslims. So that she writes in Hindi is very significant. Also is significant the fact that women in Punjab did not understand or write in Hindi. Very simple. That she's trying to build a community of Arya women in Hindi precisely because women were educated, if at all, in the Punjabi language. And not in Urdu, which was the language of education of men, irrespective of their religion. So you can see how her writing feeds into this kind of Arya Samaj politics. Not that she's given entirely to Arya Samaj politics. She has her dissent even there. So while as the editor of Bharat Bhagini, Hardevi participates in the claim of Hindi to represent Arya women, interestingly, she herself moves between languages in her own writings and writes in Urdu as well. Soon after her travel to England, where she has occasion to observe the Montessori system of schooling, she writes a book in Urdu, Talim-e-Tiflan Yani Zakhira-e Talim, which I found a mention of. I haven't found the book, but I found the mention of this book. Now, this movement across languages leads to two observations. One, that despite the one language, one community formula that was espoused by the reformist organizations to create linguistically bound communities, this was defied by the expediency of using multiple languages to address different audiences. So you see, she writes in Urdu when she tries to address a particular audience. She writes in Hindi when she tries to address a certain audience. So there's a constant shift despite this Hindu-Hindi kind of equation. Secondly, women from within the reform presses like Hardevi used the very mode of argument and rationality frequently deployed by the reformist organizations to critique patriarchal reformist positions on women's reform. So, although she comes from the Arya Samaj kind of politics, she critiques the Arya Samaj formulations on women. The title of the first book that I'll be translating, that is London Yatra, draws attention to the crucial term around which the narrative is built, that is Yatra or journey. As she narrates her journey towards imperial London, the narrator seeks to textually reconfigure her own nation and its women to facilitate their journey towards modernity. After all, London is the metropolitan sort of imperial center of modernity. So in this journey towards modernity, she's spurred by the image of a woman, Queen Victoria, reigning over the empire as its political head. So as she travels from Lahore through diverse landscapes and through diverse landscapes, cultures in the Indian subcontinent are aggregated and tied together as a nation through the eyes of the narrator. So she's already inventing a nation before it can be formed by sort of comparing, cultural practices, etc., etc. Description of cultures, social practices, and position of women in Aden, Egypt, Italy, and France stretches her imagination to cultures outside India to make claims for women as conscious civic subjects, giving to women a role in time, history, and the formation of a nation. So she very frequently uses the language of rights, the rights of women, etc. And so clearly I'm associating her with a kind of proto-feminist consciousness before Punjab sees organized women's groups in the early 20th century. Titled London Jubilee, the companion volume, the second volume, draws attention to the second crucial term around which the author organizes her autobiographical experience, that is Jubilee. The term Jubilee evokes the event of imperial celebration and also the royal person who was at the center of the spectacle, that is Queen Victoria. A substantial part of the narrative in the second book, London Jubilee, is devoted to the life history of the Queen, her public life as the Empress of India, and her private life as wife and mother. The author sets up this royal figure of Victoria as a model for herself, as well as the community of women readers in Lahore that she addresses. In an important act of cultural translation, Hardevi reclaims the Queen into the making of a modern Sugrahini, that can be translated as a good householder. So the Queen is a queen, but as a woman, she's an ideal woman, the good householder. So Hardevi projects modern conjugality onto the married life of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. The Queen is rendered into an image of the Arya woman who is highly educated, is devoted to her husband and children, and follows Pativrat Dharma, which can be loosely translated as conjugal virtue. So she's a follower of Pativrat Dharma and Stri Dharma, which is womanly duties. The ideal womanhood that the Queen represents is seamlessly accommodated within the construction of a modern, educated, and pativrata woman that was being advocated by the prevailing reform discourse in Punjab, especially the Arya Samaj. The larger process that Hardevi mobilizes here, without actually naming it, is what we might call vernacularization. I mean, Queen Victoria is vernacularized. So this vernacularization allows Hardevi to interpret her own experience of imperial modernity and articulate it for her audience through Indic vocabularies. In doing so, not only does she assimilate the new world of England into her own cultural vocabulary, but also draws British and Indian women into a sympathetic continuum, holding the Queen as an exemplar for appropriate domesticity, as well as an inspiration for the public participation of women in India. Queen Victoria thus enables Hardevi to imagine a global community of women and claim membership in it, not only for herself, but for her women readers in Punjab. So what I'm suggesting here is that rather than look at gendered solidarities, the formation of gendered solidarities through a regional perspective, that is, women from Maharashtra, women from Bengal, women from Punjab, etc. So rather than look at solidarities, gendered solidarities through the frame of province or nation, I think a transnational perspective would be a very useful perspective to examine the constitution of identity and political subjectivity, especially in an age, 19th century, when cultural flows, print networks, and travel afforded new sites of connections and mutual influences across the territorial confines of province and nation. The movement of people and traffic of publications between India and the world had facilitated reconstitution of ideas and indeed of borders between the empire and the metropolis. Thus, there are connections that I will be establishing between transnational mobilities, print, in the print spheres, transnational print spheres, gendered identity formation, and travel writing. Hardevi's writing is entangled with the political imagination of a new nation and the modern women who could be its citizen subjects. Interestingly, this new gendered self is positioned variously. So she's not all adulation for the Queen. I mean, she chides her sometimes, for doing what she's doing to India and to Indian women and doing very little for Indian women. So, so this new gendered self that Hardevi articulates is positioned variously, sometimes as an obedient subject, and at other times as an assertive, critical commentator in relation to the imperial center and its monarch, Queen Victoria. While being subjects of a woman monarch could become a means of claiming a civic subjecthood for women, we see contradictions emerge between Hardevi's liberal expectations of reform for women and her colonial subjecthood to the Queen. Modernity is therefore sometimes worthy of mimicry. I mean, in some ways, the Queen and the modernity of England, Western modernity is worthy of mimicry, but is also critiqued when it becomes coercive to the colonial subject. This oscillation between adulatory and a resistant or a subversive mode of address points towards the practice of multiple self-positioning that the colonized subject embraced in India, ranging from the assimilative to the critical to the combative. In the light of these shifts in subject position, this cross-cultural encounter that we are looking at between Hardevi and the imperial London, this cross-cultural encounter cannot be reduced to simplistic binaries of mimicry and rebellion, but instead insists on being framed as a sophisticated, self-conscious, and plural negotiation of identities that helped her to inhabit the imperial world. One last point, which is that writing travel, and the emphasis is on writing now rather than travel. Writing travel also becomes a mode to claim a new literary subjectivity for women. So it's possible for women now to be authors and earn, respect out of this authorship. So it also becomes a mode to claim a new literary subjectivity for middle-class women. One of the modes of subjectivity that became possible via print culture was a claim to professional authorship and the intellectual work that it involved. For middle-class educated women like Hardevi, being included in this sphere of writing also meant cultural power and self-affirmation. So to conclude, so I'll be assessing Hardevi as an important precursor to the formation of feminist consciousness and an organized women's movement in Punjab. Her work shows that at a time when ethics and moral conduct of women in private and public spheres were being constantly redefined by the reformers and the colonial state, women themselves were able to imagine languages of self-articulation, participation, intervention, and even resistance. They modulated oral and written cultures into new genres of expression, negotiated modes of subjectivity with the reform discourse, contested the reform idealization of women, and imaginatively delineated affective communities of belief, gendered kinship, transnational solidarities, and literary and linguistic sensibilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arti, for this fascinating presentation. And I could not resist and think about the 1889 Ramabai's volume on her encounters, American encounters, and how she looks at America, and also communicating to her Bhagini, her sisters in Maharashtra, and the idea of the ideal woman, but delineates from the idea of the Pativrata, a strong sort of tradition that in a way she carries forward of Tarabai Shinde in Sri Purush Tulna, in which she completely unpacks this whole idea of Pativrata and this idea of the pious woman, but asking women to ask more questions and not treat their husband or men as God. But it's very, very fascinating and interesting. But without taking any further time, we come to the last speaker of the day, Dr. Sanchayita Paul, who takes us now to Bengal and takes us to the world of Kailashbasini Devi and her imagination of the ideal woman invoking the necessity of education for emancipation. So Sanchayita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Priyanka. I hope I am audible enough. Okay. So can you tell me how much time I have in my hand, as this is the last presentation?
Yes, we wanted 10 to 12 minutes, but these presentations are so interesting. We can cut the time for question and answer. Please take as much time. Say 10 to 12 or 15 minutes.
Okay. Thanks a lot. And yes, really a very hectic day for me, that really defending my thesis finally after a long day's work. And that's great that this conference, this seminar actually collides with my PhD defense, because at noon, and obviously good evening to everyone there. And really, I'm really thankful to Ruth and Priyanka for giving me the opportunity to be included within this Declutter project, and to giving me the opportunity to think and to write and to speak about Kailashbasini Devi, because she is a very, very important woman. I'm passionately
Sanchayita, you got muted.
think of this histories of philosophy of women thinkers, is that we have this opportunity to present, not only revive, but to present the women who are only limited as writers, but we can present them as thinkers, as intellectuals, and as independent scholars who thought about their way. And for this very thing, I presented this talk of me, and giving it the title that Thinking in a Woman's Way. I think that's the most important thing which Kailashbasini introduced long back in 1863. And it is really a kind of a linear temporal progression backwards, that we are going back in time. And when we go back in time, what is the most important thing? That we are getting amazed by the radical voices which were hidden in the pages of history, which were hidden in the text of the women, and which must be revived to present these thinkers, and how to actually represent a gendered intellectual history in colonial Bengal. Because the time for which I am actually talking about or writing about extensively for the last 7 to 8 years, not only in my doctoral thesis, but also in my books and articles, both in Bengali as well as in English, that this time was not at all conducive enough to incorporate the women's voices or to publish them as women writers. So this is the time when they thought about women's education, when they thought about the women's writing. And also the most important part is to publish, to come up, because that's the most important part for them. Because to come out of the Andur Mahol, the inner home, and to present themselves in the public world, the outer home, the outer world. So Namrata is talking about Sant Dayabais and the process of continuities and discontinuities. Arti is talking about this idea of this journey and this transnational solidarities. And obviously, I'm keeping my comments for the Q&A session. But the most important thing is that this journey motive is very important within each and every women thinker we are presenting or we are writing about. Because the journey from this Andur Mahol to the Bahir Mahol, to come out with their own words in a written word, it is actually reclaiming the word which was completely denied to them. That's the most important thing. And also creating their identity as a Hindu, because I'm actually getting into a conversation with Namrata, because this Hinduism is not the restrictive Hindu Brahminism that was represented at that time. This Hinduism is the idea of religion in their own way, which Kailashbasini is presenting in this particular title, in choosing to giving the title to her text, that Hindu Mohila Ganer Hinavasta, or the Hindu women's education, or Bishwa Shobha, because Bishwa Shobha is a text which I later actually recognized, which contained the alternative religious ideas of Kailashbasini Devi. These women, including Sant Dayabai, that they are thinking about an alternative religious ideas, how to think about religion in a woman's way, how to going beyond the Hindu Brahminic ritualistic practices, how to think about religion to create or to enter into the process of self-fashioning, the self-fashioning of being a woman, being a spiritual. And this is also a kind of a spiritual journey for themselves to realize and to understand what they meant by being a Hindu, and how they differentiated from the other communal understanding of Hinduism, prevalent at that time and also prevalent even now. And this is when we are going through a process of saffronization. This is very important to going back to this uh, important alternative religious ideas. So this is one point which I am actually including into my project and into the translation of Kailashbasini's work. Uh, but going back into the very obvious statement about Kailashbasini, uh, that she is the first major critique of Hindu Brahminic patriarchy at that time. Why she is the first one? Because before her, two women writers, categorically, I have uh, researched it in a well documented way, so I am now confident enough to announce it. Two women writers categorically published before her. First was Krishna Kamini Dashi, who published Chittu Bilashini in 1857. And this Chittu Bilashini is very important as it combines both prose and poem. And all these women writers, specifically in Bengal, they are quite open enough about the ideas of narratology. They do not believe in this specific idiom or specific genre of prose or poem or drama. They are completely mixed, constantly rather. They are mixing these genres, and they are creating a kind of a fluid narrative where they can move freely from prose to poem and poem to prose. And we can see it in all the major writers, whether it is Rajsundari Devi, whether it is Kailashbasini Devi. Bishwashobha actually is this kind of a text where she mixes up both prose and poetry. Whether it is the first Bengali women's text that was sorry, that was published in Krishna Kamini Dashi, that also blends this prose and poem medium. And Krishna Kamini was the first important women writer in a way that she presented the critique of the Hindu Brahminic patriarchy. She presented her point of view on widow remarriage bill that was just enacted on this very year, 1856. And then comes Bama Sundari Devi, who was the immediate predecessor of Kailashbasini Devi, and she was actually accorded with the title of the first woman essayist in Bengali. With that essay, what would be the superstition that must be removed for the betterment of our country? Ki ki kusangskar tirohito hoile shigro edeshe sribiddhi hoite pare. So this text was known as the first women's essay published in Bengali. Kailashbasini was quite radical enough in writing the first book of essays. She was the first book writer, Grontho Rachoyitri. She is actually introducing herself as the Grontho Rachoyitri, the woman writer of a book. And she was quite conscious about this identity. Why this happened? There actually lies a small biographical details, which obviously I will go back to. But this is the identity which makes us special, that the woman in 1863, when no woman dared to come open into the public and expressing her own opinion in a public way. It is far, far away in publishing something in written words. So she is coming up, she is publishing a book, not only one book, that is followed by another 2 books. First one is Hindu Mohila Ganar Hinamasta, which I am translating. Second one is Hindu Abulakuler Vidyabhasya Tahar Samunnati. And third one is Bishwashobha. These 3 books consecutively in 1863, 1865, and 1867. And then one essay, Shobhota o Kusanskar, roughly translated as civilization and social reform, Samaj Sanskar, sorry. So, but all these essays, what is the most important thing is that all these essays are very much potent enough to give serious social and political statements about colonial Bengal and how a woman is thinking about a society at that time. Sorry, and my voice is broken today because I have extensively presented at noon also on my defense, and now I am again doing so. So sorry for this kind of an interruptions, but still. So this social and political statement, which I am presenting her as the social thinker of her time. And that's the most important thing, that the woman who is not only presenting herself as a thinker, as an intellectual, but also a social thinker who is quite conscious about all the social reform policies which were quite evident and prevalent at that time, and also the loopholes of the reform policies. All the women, or the conscious women, or the educated women, they are conscious about their about the social reforms prevalent at that time. But what is important about Kailashbasini is that she is also very much aware about the loopholes within the social reforms policies. Because now I go back to her personal life, and then you can actually realize why she sounds to be so radical, and why I am claiming that she is a very radical voice at that time. Because her text does not posit this kind of radical tone apparently. If we read Kailashbasini's text, It seems to be a kind of a balance between the contesting voices and a kind of a negotiation, some subjugating voices, some compliances towards the patriarchal logic. So this is the kind of an apparent impression a reader can get when reading Kailashbasini. But if you go back to her biographical details, if you go back to the social, political, cultural, religious condition of that time, if you go back to the women writers of her time, if you go back to her choice to become an essayist, which was the most marginalized genre in women writing at that time, then you can realize why she is so important. So going back to her personal details, biographical details, we find very few details about her life. Even her death year still remain unknown. 1837 is her year of birth. That we can know because in a very brief introduction about herself in Grontho Rachoyitrir Porichoy, the introduction towards the book writer she has herself given, we come to know that when she was married to Durga Charan Gupta, and why Durga Charan Gupta is also a very important figure. We go back. I will go back to it. She was then only 12 years old, so she was the direct. She had the direct experience of going through child marriage. So she knew what are the side effects of child marriage on a woman's life at that time. This is number one. This is number two. She was deprived of education at her childhood. The very important point about all these women, Krishna Kamini, Bama Sundari, Kailashbasini, Krishna Bhavini, most of the women writers of 19th century were deprived of formal public education. They were educated at home. And here, men come doing feminism, that the husbands become supportive for them in educating them. Not only believing in gender equality, but getting an ideal partner for the reformed husband. So it is a kind of an opportunity the women grabbed. That this is the point, that you can get an ideal partner, but I can be the conscious, subjective self. So this is a kind of a game which was hidden at that time. And that's the basic opportunity all the women writers actually explored at that time, that they exploited this opportunity. I will use this word, exploited this opportunity of getting that quote unquote new reformed ideal wife. And on the other hand, they became conscious about their own rights, because the women thought, the husbands thought that they would get a kind of a reformed woman who would ultimately reform the whole household, who would bring in ideal citizens for these new nations, and who would be the ideal mother, ideal wife, ideal homemaker, and who would be called the new woman, the Bhadra Mohila. Kailashbasini and her fellow women thinkers, writers of that time, they completely silently rather revolted against this project of making the ideal partner. They obviously took this opportunity, their husbands, their fathers, their brothers, all the reformed male members provided to them. And they ultimately became conscious about their rights, about their intellectual position within the society, and they choose to write about their social political thoughts and their way of understanding reform, their way of thinking about the condition of women, which is quite popular issue at that time. They are presenting the women's question in their own way, and they are the most important thing, they are presenting their critique of Hindu Brahminic patriarchy, and that's the most important part of my thesis. So going back to Durga Charan Gupta, Durga Charan Gupta again was a Bhadralok reformer, but he was more known as the publisher of Gupta Ponjika. Ponjika is a kind of an Hindu almanac, maintaining which we actually performed our Hindu rituals. So Ponjika is also something which is quite popular in the traditional Hindu household. So he was the publisher of the Gupta full Ponjika, that is the complete almanac. And it is still even in print, and it is still very popular. And Durgacharan Gupta was initially attracted towards Brahmo ideals, Brahmo Samaj, which was for the greater introduction to it, or a kind of a better elaboration on Brahmo Samaj. I am just briefly commenting on it, that Brahmo Samaj was founded by Raja Ram Mohan Rai, who thought about various social reform, but the major point of social reform in Brahmo Samaj was the reform of the condition of women. They were very instrumental. The members of the Brahmo Samaj were quite instrumental in introducing women's education, in introducing women's marriage discourses, the reformed marriage discourses, and they also introduced all the marriage laws, the Age of Consent Act, the Hindu marriage law, which is now popular quite, and also and the most important thing is the ban of the Shotidaho Protha, the ban of the immolation of the widows. So this is briefly exploring on Brahmo Samaj. So Durgacharan Gupta was initially attracted towards Brahmo Samaj, and then in his later years, he moved towards Hinduism. And this is obviously reflected in his venture in publishing the Gupta Ponjika. Durgacharan Gupta taught his wife Kailashbasini Gupta within his own home. And then Durgacharan Gupta was the publisher of the 3 books of Kailashbasini. And that's the important part, that Durgacharan Gupta was quite instrumental in publishing the books of Kailashbasini. Otherwise, at that time, it was quite difficult for Kailashbasini Devi to find a publisher. And this difficulty is evident in the Pratishtha Patra, or the certificate of authentication, that was provided by Ananda Chandra Vedanta Bagish, the Brahmo leader of that time. Ananda Chandra Vedanta Bagish, in his certificates to Kailashbasini's 2 books, The Woeful State of Hindu Woman and Hindu Women's Progress, categorically certified that these 2 books are really written by Kailashbasini Devi, and Durgacharan Gupta did not help in it. This certificate is quite necessary in a way, because we need to understand this actually reflects the contemporary on the contemporary social condition, or the social attitudes toward women. First, the women's writing, even if it was published, even if it came out in the public spaces, was not believed as an original writing. It was believed to be written by the husbands and then published in the wife's name. So for Kailashbasini, it was the first challenge to authenticate her own writing. This is number 1. Number 2, Ananda Chandra also categorically mentioned that Durgacharan did not help in the writing of the text. Why this is important? In my defense today, I faced a question from Ruth Morgan, who is an Australian consulate thinker here. She asked me whether I am really aware of the influences of the male writers on the women, or whether Kailashbasini or the women writers at the time actually faced a kind of a contribution, or faced a kind of a deeper influence of the male writers on their text. Obviously, when they were educated, when they were taught by their husband, there can be a kind of an influence. But what is important, that in case of Kailashbasini, she chose to write on these issues, which were quite debatable at that time. because it is a woman's insight critic into the processes of the everyday life, how the everyday life of a woman functioned in colonial Bengal. What was the lived experience of these women writers? How that personal experiences can be politicized, how they represented the idea of Sangsar, which is categorically, and I deeply believed in it, and I also elaborated this in my work, that how this idea of Sangsar that they critically represented in their text is different from the understanding of family or mere domesticity. And how Kailashbasini was quite conscious about these contemporary critical voices against women's work, that her voice could not be believed as an authentic voice. Her work could not be believed as independent, and this is the reason for which in the beginning of my presentation, I am presenting her as an independent thinker. Why this independent thought could not be recognized by the contemporary critic? And these two texts, and also the contemporary reviews of these two texts of Kailashbasini's works, revealed her fear as true. That exactly the contemporary readers, some of them obviously introduced this text as very radical, if not radical, at least welcome them, that okay, this is a good thing that women come up and write. But most of the criticism is something which is against Kailashbasini, and that's the actual reason behind the discontinuities which Namrata taught, I think. Namrata spoke about this idea of discontinuity in women's writing, because the constant resistance, the constant critique, constant suspicion about the authenticity of the women's voice deeply marginalized these women writers. Even now, even women still thought about or becoming suspicious, becoming very inhibitions, that a kind of an inhibition constantly working within them. What we think and what we write, that can be equal or not. There is always a gap between the thinking and between the writing. So this is the reason that Kailashbasini becoming so radical. She very subtly, very silently, very intuitively representing these strands, these social, political, cultural attitudes of 19th century Bengal within her works. And these are weaved within the narrative. A longer part of this, of my monograph, will work on the narratology of Kailashbasini, because it will obviously focus on this fluidity of the text, how they moved from one place to another, how they defied the understanding of the form of essay. This is not the essay which we were taught as the essay. This is not the essay as something objective that we were taught in our childhood or in our graduation period. Rather, this is the essay which they introduced as the essay. This is the essay which is like a kind of a conversation. I point it as discursive essays, where I use the word discourse in its basic meaning without any theoretical baggage. That is the conversation. How they use it as a kind of a conversation. Conversation with whom? Conversation with the other women writers, other women of the time. Their target people are not the general male public. Rather, they were very hopeless about the male readers of that time, but they were very much confident in instilling within the women of the time that they could change their lot. If not a lot, at least a little. At least we are also changing our lives a little, so this kind of a little steps towards a kind of understanding the intellectual tradition from a woman's way, understanding and thinking in a woman's way. This is the kind of a little steps we are taking, and these little steps were quite important. So when Kailashbasini is writing about her experiences, and this is the anecdotal part of this essays, every essays, whether it is in Hindu Mohila Ganar Hinavasta, or whether it is in the Hindu Women's Progress, or in Vishwashobha, all these texts includes a lot of anecdotes, and this is the way she represents her critique of Hindu Brahminic patriarchy. She narrated the tales of Kulin polygamy. She narrated the tales of child brides. She narrated the tales of widows. She narrated the tales of young beau, young wife within the torturous Hindu domesticity. For her, the Sangsar is not at all an happy place. For her, it is the source of all kinds of domestic confinement, complete intellectual opposition, and also a complete burden on a woman's subjective self. It is a denial of her subjective, psychological, mental, intellectual freedom.
Sanchayita, last 1 minute, because we are
we can understand.
One closing argument.
Okay, so just it's really a fascinating talk, and Priyanka, you are true. I can actually talk hours after hours on Kailashbasini. So, and you can actually understand that this is a completely impromptu presentation. I have no time today to present a kind of a PowerPoint presentation or a kind of a full-fledged paper for this conference. But what is more important in the last comment on Kailashbasini Devi, that we, not only Kailashbasini Devi, we need to reread all these women thinkers in understanding the intellectual history. This is becoming a very popular word now, gendered intellectual history. When Priyanka began her journey in the world of gendered intellectual history, or when I began my journey in the gendered intellectual history, in exploring gendered intellectual history in India, in colonial Bengal rather, this was not a very popular word at the time. But now it is a very popular word. But what is important now, that this gendered intellectual history is not from the Western perspective. For me, the most important part for reading Kailashbasini Devi is positing an alternative feminist idiom. In reading women's studies from India, from this intellectual tradition, from exploring this intellectual history, we can recreate a complete alternative feminist idiom. And this feminist imaginary is quite necessary. And that can be done by reviving these lost voices, by understanding these new women, and by exploring all this text in a woman's way. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Sanchayita. It's been really the longest day for you, because Sanchayita had her defense in the afternoon, Indian time. And Sanchayita's like, I don't know if I can do it. I'm like, you can speak, somebody wakes you up from sleep and you would be able to give like an entire lecture on Kailashbasini Devi, because, all these women thinkers that we work with, we are so invested, because many a times you just find yourself, completely lost and immersed in what they propose. So I mean, just like, I'm so excited. And Ruth, thank you so much. Look at this poster. I mean, all these women philosophers, and it's the legacy, when Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay is there with her bindi. When she was writing, she never imagined that there would be a time when people would be working on her. I work on her. There's so many people who are working on it. And that's the case, I'm sure, with Dayabai or Hardevi or Kailashbasini Devi or Emily Chatelet, that Ruth has been working with her team so significantly on German women philosophers. But, it's the legacy and it's the search of the lost. And it is our, I will not say responsibility. It's not responsibility, but it is our passion. It is our dedication to find these feminist foremothers. The very reason, I keep harboring this, I keep arguing this, that, if women in India wouldn't have struggled, agitated, and not had their own voice, it wouldn't have been possible for Indian women I mean, for us to do what we are doing, not just philosophy, not just history, not just literature, but to create that space. I would want to use the word that Meera Kosambi writes, she calls crossing threshold. The very reason that they were crossing so many thresholds at times when it was just unthinkable was to create the space for us. And this space that we've created here through this conversation, through this round table, is also an invitation for finding more voices. Some of the key themes that emerges in the course of our round table is this long history. We started with 17th century with Dayabai. We come to 18th century and 19th century, and then we come to 20th century. And, I want to take it back to the 3rd century BC by bringing in Therigatha, which is the first 5th century BC, which is the first recorded anthology of women voices. So these women had a voice. They had not just voice, agency. They were witnessing things. They were responding, and they were intervening. They were interlocuting. But the problem is, as the very significant issue that Ruth did with a lot of other people at the Monoist, the journal was raising these questions that women voices have been there, but why is it that we failed in bringing them or giving them the due attention that should have been given to them long time back? But the problem then again goes to the whole notion of how knowledge is produced, how knowledge is created, how knowledge is disseminated. And I call it the problem of the very male canon, because this canon has been exclusionary, this canon has invisibilized, this canon has marginalized a lot of other voices, and most significantly women voices. So what the center has been doing here, I mean, I'm very, very happy that I am here at the center, because I can watch closely, though I've been associated with them for last 6-7 years, but to see the kind of work and their contribution in making women not just visible, not just present, but engaging equally. And once again, I remember there was this very interesting presentation, and I was talking to Ruth about the problem of translation. The problem is that there's so much which has been written in vernaculars. And there she comes out with De Gruyter on a series of finding these, works, these voices, and the translation. So, I mean, I would now request Professor Ruth Hagengruber to say a few words. And I think we have very little time for question and answers. We just have 10 minutes. So, how would you like to take some questions, or just, I mean, a last few words? And maybe I can share the email IDs of all the 3 speakers, so that people who are interested in asking or knowing more about their work can write to them. So Professor Hagengruber.
I'm really happy to take the opportunity to add a few words, because experiencing and hearing what you have been saying, it opens new perspectives to myself. So I have understood, and also the question of the nation building and the situation. And this would also be a question for me to Professor Minocha, to which I will come back when I make some remarks on that, what Priyanka has said now. Because I think so what I experience now with this series is that this intellectual gendered history, or the history we are writing when we are rediscovering the women's voices, is that this history is different. So someone said this is now the Indians' women's history. But for me, being occupied with so many different continents here, and hearing what women are saying there. So, and I can add, to some extent, I'm really a universalist. So even Pedro, I don't know what he's saying. He has presented the women from Brazil, from Latin America. And it is incredible how overlapping the ideas are between the women, all over the world. And these are different issues. So the topics that are made and built and construed by women seem to me to develop a really completely different history of concepts and ideas and so on. This is really interesting. So this is really interesting, and it is very interesting. And now I come back, perhaps I only ask one question to Professor Arti Minocha on Hardevi of Lahore, because I would like to know in that context, if she would hold, so Professor Minocha, if you hold that Hardevi of Lahore is a kind of precursor of the Indian national idea, or and also how did she think of the idea of equality, in that context? I would be very much interested now to have a clear stand for me. As we know, I think the French women have been really inventive, not only the French, the Italian women, and inventive for speaking in favor of equality and so on. It has not been the males who brought the topic forward. And for that reason, or this is how my question is directed to.
Thanks for the question. Can I, Priyanka, shall I?
Yes, please.
Respond? Okay. How Hardevi was sort of how she furthered feminist consciousness in Punjab or in the nation. Well, she was a very small player, can I say, yet undiscovered, yet untalked about, yet not talked about. There were women from Punjab who were much more politically involved. Say, for example, taking representations to political leaders, or going to London with with representations, etc. They engaged much more with the political establishment. So, say, for example, from Punjab, you would find Sarla Devi Chaudhrani's name, who was a contemporary of hers. She's known. There's an autobiography attributed to her. She came from Bengal, married into Punjab. She was Rabindranath Tagore's sister's daughter. So you would, politically well connected, presented petitions to the establishment. So what I'm trying to say is that some women, for other reasons, for political reasons, for other reasons, came much more into the limelight, and are therefore more well known. They are known as sort of contributors to this kind of proto-feminist consciousness that we're talking about. Hardevi, for some reason, disappears. I hadn't heard of her name. I sort of accidentally found this travel account. When I talk to people who have worked on Punjab, they haven't heard her name. So somehow, I don't know if we can directly attribute the development of feminist consciousness to Hardevi. I mean, there is not a one-to-one equivalent or link that I would like to trace. In fact, it was a collective effort, and I would like to see her as one of the voices. So that was my answer to the first part of the question. I think there was a second part as well, which I've forgotten. Sorry.
No, I mean, I just want to quickly add to what Arti was saying, that Hardevi is one of the voices, because there's a wonderful book by Gail Minault on secluded scholars, and she's trying to excavate similar women voices and the journals that they were doing, Muslim women, then the Sikh women, and then the Hindu women.
Bringing together the different nations.
Different
nations. Yeah, but we don't go into a discussion.
And around the same time, Maharashtra, such radical things were happening, starting with Savitri Bai Phule, and then, the rich heritage that Sanchayita just bought from Bengal, and in Andhra down south there were similar movements that was happening. So I think what is rather fascinating is that this account of nation making, the histories of nation making, whether with the national school or with the Cambridge school or subaltern school, have done huge injustice to women contribution, and all these exemplary women who were doing such phenomenal work. But then again, the problem of just limiting them as social reformers. I mean, I was just Arti, thinking about the parallels that Pandita Ramabai has with Hardevi, her association with Pratna Samaj, but also at the same time her critique of Pratna Samaj, and then creating another organization for women work, and the kind of work she did for women's education is rather fascinating. So it's just like all around there were things which were happening that women were doing. And now I think with this surge of finding these philosophers and these thinkers and these intellectuals and their role, I think, I mean, not just India, I think Pedro will also agree with me. We've had a lot of discussions about what the parallels that you can find in Brazil and in India, a lot of questions that are emerging in Africa, a lot of questions which are happening, emerging in South America, a lot of questions which are emerging in Asia, related to the question of colonialism, and also the history before that, needs to be really brought in significantly when we're talking about a larger notion of the gendered self and society, and also the discourse on philosophy.
Yeah.
You want to?
Yeah. Perhaps I add something, because yes, of course, there's no doubt that there is a special history, a special gendered history, perhaps, in regard to the colonialism and so on. But this is what I wanted to say. It seems to me that beyond that, as women have been part of or subjected in colonialism and all that, it gives us a completely different perspective now to understand exactly when the history of colonialism or decolonialization and so on is done, to see that this is not enough to do the decolonization and so on, because the women's history behind that,
Yes,
this is to a certain part, I would say it's the same in Europe, then it is. So it's the same. There are overlappings between the colonializers and the colonialized. And this is from women's point of view and perspective. This is really a new approach to the history of philosophy. I think this is what I wanted to say. And this gives us a possibility to create a new area of categories thinking philosophically. So this was what. Thank you to all of you, and I'm very happy with the whole series. Thank you very much, and thank you to Priyanka to bring all these women's voices here to a fore.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. First of all, my gratitude for the center for organizing this intercontinental series of conversation on women philosophy, and then De Gruyter for the series, and most importantly, my panelist, Dr. Namrata, Dr. Arti, and Dr. Sanchayita for really staying up so late and being part of this amazing conversation, and telling to the world that women were there, they made history, they created history, and it is for us to bring those ideas when we talk about the larger notion of emancipation, liberation, liberty, equality, all these concepts. And also thank you to all the participants who've so patiently been listening to us for the last 2 hours. And on that note, this is the conclusion of the 1,000 Places in One World intercontinental seminar series that Professor
Can
Ruth
I just add
Hagengruber had
something, Priyanka?
curated.
Sorry.
Yes.
Special congratulations to Sanchayita, Dr. Sanchayita.
Yes, and big celebrations.
Big congratulations.
For Dr. Sanchayita Paul.
Everyone. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you for giving giving me the opportunity to represent Kailashbasini in this intercontinental platform. Thanks a lot.
Once again, celebrate hard, Sanchayita. Are you at home or in a restaurant?
Actually, I'm in the hotel. I'm here to attend the defense, so I'm in the hotel.
Okay, okay. So you have a great, great celebration, and thank you so much for finding the time to share this day with us. Thank you. Okay, everyone. Bye-bye.